Chapter 23, Ideologies and Upheavals. So if you look at the years, you'll notice that this particularly is an important date because it is the year that Napoleon fell from power. So in this chapter, we're going to look at the ideologies that emerged after Napoleon fell from power, namely conservatism and socialism and nationalism. The aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, and we'll be starting with the European balance of power. So in 1814, the Quadruple Alliance, which consisted of Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Great Britain, finally defeated France, and afterwards they agreed to meet at the Congress of Vienna to come up with a general peace settlement. And so the First Peace of Paris gave to France the boundaries that it had before 1792, which were actually larger than those of 1789. And it restored the Bourbon dynasty to power. And so basically they put Louis XVI, who had been executed, his brother, Louis XVIII, back on the throne. And the Quadruple Alliance combined leniency toward France with strong defensive measures that included uniting the lower countries under the Dutch monarchy and increasing Prussian territory to act as like a sentinel on the Rhine. Sentinel is like a soldier or a guard. So basically they were being watch guards along the Rhine to make sure that no country would try to take over the rest of Europe like France had done. And so the foreign ministers of Austria and Great Britain, Austria's was Clemens von Metternich, and Great Britain's foreign minister was Lord Castlereagh, and their French counterpart, Charles Talleyrand, used this idea of the balance of power to discourage aggression by any combination of states. And Napoleon actually undid this agreement briefly when he escaped from the island of Elba after being exiled the first time and started up his wars of expansion again. But when he was defeated at Waterloo in 1815, the agreement resumed. And so the Second Peace of Paris, this was concluded after Napoleon's final defeat. This one was also lenient with France, although this time France was required to pay an indemnity and to support an army of occupation for 5 years. So the Quadruple Alliance agreed then that they would meet periodically and they would discuss common interests and primarily guard the peace in Europe. That was their primary objective. And so this European system of Congress lasted well into the 19th century and settled many international crises through international conferences and balance of power diplomacy. Okay, so repressing the revolutionary spirit. Even though the Quadruple Alliance was really lenient with France, they were much less flexible in their own countries. They feared what happened in France happening in their own countries. And so in a crusade against the ideas and the politics of revolution, the conservative leaders of Austria, Prussia, and Russia formed the Holy Alliance. And this became a symbol of the repression of liberal and revolutionary movements all over Europe. So in 1820, revolutionaries actually succeeded in forcing the monarchs of Spain and the southern Italian kingdom of the Two Sicilies to grant liberal constitutions against their wills. And so Metternich of Austria and Alexander I of Russia proclaimed the principle of active intervention in order to maintain all autocratic regimes. Autocratic, again, referring to this idea of an absolute ruler or a monarch. They feared having any type of democratic government. So Austrian forces restored Ferdinand I to the throne of the Two Sicilies in 1821, while French armies in 1823 likewise restored the Spanish regime. And so Metternich continued to fight against liberal political change, and until 1848, his system of repression of liberal ideas was actually quite effective in Central Europe, where his power was the greatest. And Metternich's policies really dominated the entire German Confederation, which at this point comprised 38 independent German states, including Austria and Prussia. So in 1819, Metternich had the German Confederation issue the infamous Carlsbad Decrees, and this required the 38 German states to root out any and all subversive ideas or rebellious or revolutionary or democratic ideas, and established a permanent committee to investigate and punish liberal or radical organizations, again out of fear of what happened during the French Revolution. So Metternich and conservatism. Prince Clemens von Metternich was a determined defender of the status quo, and he was an aristocrat who made a brilliant diplomatic career as Austria's foreign prime minister from 1809 to 1848. And so he defended his class of aristocracy and its rights and its privileges with a clear conscience, and at the same time blamed liberal middle-class revolutionaries for stirring up the lower classes. Liberalism appeared doubly dangerous to Metternich because it went along with national aspirations and a belief that each people or each national group had a right to establish its own independent government and to seek to fulfill its destiny. And so the multi-ethnic state that Metternich served was strong in a sense, but it was also weak. It was strong because of its large population and its vast territories, but it was weak because of its many and potentially dissatisfied nationalities, which included Italians, Romanians, various Slavic peoples, all under the control of a German and Hungarian or Magyar minority. So Metternich had to oppose liberalism and nationalism, for Austria was just unable to accommodate these ideologies of revolution. So in his efforts to hold back liberalism and repress nationalism, Metternich was supported by Russia and to a lesser extent by the Ottomans. But after 1815, both of these multinational absolutist states worked hard to preserve their traditional conservative orders. The spread of radical ideas. And in this slide, we're going to look at 4 radical ideas that emerged after 1815. And they are liberalism, nationalism, socialism, and Marxism. So all of these were pretty much in contrast to Metternich and his conservatism. But liberalism was especially in contrast to Metternich. And the basic idea here is that people should have liberty or freedom and equality. And they demanded representative government instead of an autocratic monarchy and equality before the law. And so opponents of liberalism mostly targeted its economic principles because economically liberals called for unrestricted private enterprise and no government interference in the economy. This philosophy is known as the doctrine of laissez-faire or hands-off economics, so no government restriction. This was most enthusiastically embraced by the business class. And so laissez-faire economics has been associated even since then with business interests. Labor unions were outlawed because they supposedly restricted free competition and the individual's right to work. And as liberalism became increasingly identified with the middle class after 1815, some intellectuals and enemies of conservatism felt that liberalism didn't go far enough, that it needed to go further. And liberal radicals called for even universal voting rights, at least for males, and for democracy. And they were more willing than most liberals to endorse violent upheaval to achieve their goals. And you see that a lot of times with the radical side of things. And you see that with radical Marxism as well, endorsing violence to achieve goals. The second radical idea that we're going to look at is nationalism. And the early advocates of nationalism were greatly inspired by a guy named Johann Gottfried von Herder. And he was an 18th century philosopher and historian, and he argued that people had their own genius and their own cultural identity. And so the people who advocated nationalism or pride in one's country, finding your identity with your country or your ethnicity, the early people who believed that got these ideas from Johann Gottfried von Herder. So in the early 19th century, so early 1800s, that's the time period we're talking about, this cultural unity was a good idea, but it was really difficult to achieve because there was an abundance of local dialects that kept peasants from nearby villages from understanding each other, and historical memory that divided the inhabitants of European states just as much as it unified them. So it was really difficult to achieve unity because of the local dialects. Even if a group of people were from the same place or spoke the same language, the dialect was different enough that it divided them. And so, at any rate, the rise of nationalism depended heavily on the development of industry and urban society, which required better communication between individuals and groups. And so in order to achieve this dream of nationalism, nationalists promoted use of a standardized national language. And the way they would achieve that was through mass education, which would create at least a superficial cultural identity and cultural unity within many countries. Early nationalists usually believed that every nation, like every citizen, had the right to exist in freedom and to develop its own character and spirit. Yet, early nationalism developed this strong sense of we versus they, to which nationalists added two ingredients. The first was a sense of national mission, and the other, which would eventually lead to lots of warfare, was a sense of national superiority. Okay, so we're going to look at some French utopian socialists, and I've made room to write their names up here because they are French and hard to spell, some of them. Okay, so early French socialist thinkers believed in economic planning, and they argued that the government should organize the economy and not depend on competition, which could be destructive to the job or to the workplace or to industry. And so they had an intense desire to help the poor. And in doing that, they preached economic equality among the people and believed that private property should be strictly regulated by the government. So the first one is Count Henri de Saint-Simon. And we'll just put Saint Simon. Count Henri or Henry de Saint-Simon. And just for reference, we're looking at 1760 to 1825. And he proclaimed that the key to progress was proper social organization, where the leading scientists and engineers and industrialists would carefully plan the economy and lead it forward by undertaking vast public works projects. So the second one is Charles Fourier. And his idea was to have a social utopia of self-sufficient communities and give women total emancipation. Another one, we're going through these kind of quickly, but just to give the highlights. Louis Blanc focused on practical improvements, and in his work, which was called Organization of Work, he urged workers to fight for universal voting rights and to take control of the state peacefully. And then Pierre Joseph Proudhon, maybe I'm probably butchering that. He wrote What is Property in 1840, and he argued that property was profit that was stolen from the worker, because the worker was the source of all wealth, and usually those with lots of property didn't do lots of actual work. So the message of these French utopian socialists interacted with the experiences of French urban workers who became violently opposed to laissez-faire laws, because those laissez-faire laws, they believed, denied workers their rights, like organizing, establishing unions, or even having guilds. So this was in direct opposition to liberalism. I think it's safe to say that Karl Marx took socialism a step further. And in 1848, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels published the Communist Manifesto, which became like a socialist Bible, pretty much. He believed that the interests of the middle class, which he called the bourgeoisie, maybe the hardest word ever to spell. And again, this is the middle class, the bourgeoisie. He believed that the interests of these people and those of the industrial working class, called the proletariat, were inevitably opposed to each other. And so he predicted that the ever-poor proletariat, which was constantly growing in size and in class consciousness, ever aware of their poverty, would conquer the bourgeoisie in a violent revolution. And Marx's socialist ideas sort of synthesized not only the French utopian ideas, but also English classical economics and German philosophy. So Marx basically believed that every historical age had some type of class struggle. And so his ultimate goal with communism, which would be achieved through violent overthrow of government, was to set up a structure upon the common ownership of the means of production. So industry, railroads, basically everything involving production or producing some type of good or service. The absence of social classes in a true communist economy, even the absence of money and the state. So we will end there today.